Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Talk They Hear You podcast. What parents are saying, prevention wisdom, authenticity, and empowerment. This podcast is brought to you by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. Talk They Hear You is a national prevention campaign that aims to help parents and caregivers talk with their kids about the dangers and risks of underage drinking and other drug use. In this podcast, we'll hear what's working and what isn't, and what might be missing in our efforts to help kids navigate away from drugs and alcohol. I'm Debbie Burnt, Director of Parent Movement 2.0, and I'll be your host. As a reminder, the views expressed here are not necessarily those of SAMHSA or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Today, we welcome Dr. Caroline Dupont and Corinne Shea from the Institute for Behavior and Health, IBH. It's a research and policy organization with a mission to reduce the use of illegal drugs. Dr. Dupont is the vice president of IBH, and she is certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and by the American Board of Addiction Medicine. She has a private practice in psychiatry and has overseen numerous research projects. She is co-author of a number of publications and several book chapters on anxiety and addiction. Corinne Shea has been with IBH in various positions since 2007. She is currently the Director of Programs and Communication and is responsible for the organization and management of drug policy initiatives and IBH priorities. One of those priorities is the One Choice curriculum and community. So welcome, both of you. Very glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. So glad to be here.
So today's episode is a little bit of a back to school episode, but what we really want to focus on is that one choice message and the science and the perspective behind it. We want to touch on some parenting strategies. And we also want to note that both of you are mothers. So if you want to tell us a little bit about your kids and get us started on this one choice message and what does it mean, that'd be great.
Fantastic. Yes. So I am a mother to a high school senior and also a young adult. So I've been through many back to schools of my own and also for my kids, and I'm very excited to share all that with you.
And just to chime in quickly, I am the proud parent of a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old. So back to school is still new to me. We have daycare, but it's exciting to get into these early elementary school years and maybe a little nerve-wracking for what's coming, but I do feel prepared and ready for it. I hope so.
That's great. I really appreciate the different age range of kids that you both represent. Parenting is very progressive, but there are common themes that run throughout the entire childhood cycle. So this is great. Please tell us about One Choice.
One Choice is something that we came up with over several years. So it didn't start out with that name. It started out with data and research that we put together in a way that was new. And we're going to get to share some of that with you, which I'm really happy to be able to do. But ultimately, what it showed us is that kids are making the choice to use or to not to use in a really dramatic way. And so one choice has to do with that choice that each individual makes, whether they are someone that uses drugs, which include alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, and other substances, or whether they're someone that doesn't use those substances. And we've put this together into a health standard. So it's a health standard that's similar to other health standards that we use all the time, like wear your seatbelts or wear your bicycle helmet. And so we have it in one phrase, which is no use of any alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, or other drugs by youth under the age of 21 for reasons of health. And that's a lot of words, and you'll understand, hopefully, as we go along, why we have so many words in that. But because it's so many words, we've figured out that just saying one choice kind of encapsulates all of that.
And that's one choice not to use.
It is. That's really what it's boiling down to, is it's one choice to use or not to use is really what the choice is.
So tell us about, why is this important that kids choose not to use?
So One of the things is you have to figure out what you're trying to prevent when you talk about any of these things. And a lot of times we kind of go to the most extreme. We're trying to prevent substance use disorders, or we're trying to prevent other bad outcomes from substance use. And when you look at the illness of substance use disorders, one of the things that surprises people is that they're actually pediatric onset illnesses. 9 out of 10 adults with a substance use disorder, so someone who's diagnosed with significant substance use problems, initiated that use before the age of 18. So that's 90% of them had before the age of 18, and usually significantly before the age of 18. And research shows that the earlier and the heavier that use or that exposure to these substances, the more likely they are to develop significant problems, including substance use disorders and other kind of, again, bad outcomes like poor school performance, not graduating from college on time, or difficult job environments. And so we really like to think about, what are we doing in the process that can help that person develop into their best self?
So why do you think the research is showing that kids are so much more vulnerable to the use of drugs and alcohol?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the things we're really fortunate to have now, we've known this for a long time, but we didn't necessarily know why. But some of the amazing scientific research that's come out of NIH has shown that the brain is continuing to develop way up till the mid-20s. And it's really exciting. And if I could show it to you, I would leap out and show it to you. But you can see that the brain has, a baby's brain is going to be developing a lot, and a toddler and that sort of thing, thinking about that ages and stages. And we can now show with all sorts of computer modeling that brain development is continuing vigorously through the high school years, but significantly even through the college years and into the early 20s. And anything that affects the developing brain can have an outsized effect on that person long term. It can actually change the way that brain is developing. And so one of the things we see, this another like similar thing, is brain protection from concussions. And when I was a kid, no one really worried about concussions. I mean, it was just a thing that happened. I mean, there was kind of even humor about someone losing consciousness or being like a little out of sorts or something like that after a concussion. But we didn't really think about what the long-term effects of that could be. And now, there's pretty scary research that shows that concussions can have long-term effects, and especially repeated concussions. So that's kind of a physical manifestation of the same kind of thing you see with substance use. So repeated substance use is doing that kind of brain changing at that vulnerable time and setting that person up to all sorts of other risk factors.
The brain development piece seems to be something that we're learning more and more about. And it seems to becoming a very important parenting understanding. But tell us, what about the substances do we need to understand relative to the brain development?
Sure, I'll jump in here. So I'm really excited to share some of the data that the Institute for Behavior and Health has analyzed about the connection between substance use for young people. We analyzed data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, taking a nationally representative sample of over 17,000 youth between the ages of 12 and 17. And what we did is we took the data set and we said, let's divide these youth between 12 and 17 into two groups. And so we asked them in the past month, or I should say the survey asked them in the past month, have you used marijuana? And if they said no, we put them in one group. If they said yes, they had used marijuana, they were in another group. That was the only difference between these two groups. We controlled for differences like age, sex, race, and ethnicity. The kids who had used marijuana in the past month could have used once, could have used every day. It didn't matter, just that they had, in fact, used marijuana in the past month. Now, when we compared those two groups, we looked at their use of other substances. And what we found was that young people who had used marijuana in the past month were dramatically more likely to report having used alcohol, cigarettes, and other illicit drugs. These numbers are really high. Compared to their peers who didn't use any marijuana in the past month, those who did were 5.6 times more likely to report using alcohol, and just some alcohol. They were also nearly 8 times more likely to report binge drinking. And of course, binge drinking is consuming 4 or 5 drinks of alcohol in a single setting.
Wow.
They were nearly 15 times more likely to report heavy alcohol use. And heavy alcohol use is binge drinking 5 or more times in the past month.
Wow. So that idea where parents say, I'm just going to let my kids smoke a little pot, it's better for them, and they won't use other substances, is just not showing up in the data.
No, it's not. And again, this isn't to say that any young person who uses marijuana in the past month is going to use alcohol, other illicit drugs, cigarettes, but their risk dramatically increases. I mean, compared to their peers who didn't use marijuana, those who did were almost 10 times more likely to report other illicit drug use. So that could be non-medical use of prescription drugs.
MDMA, cocaine.
Apart. Exactly.
Right. Wow.
Exactly. And it isn't just marijuana versus non-marijuana use that we looked at. We also looked at alcohol use. And the young people who didn't use any alcohol in the past month had really low rates of using marijuana, other illicit drugs, and cigarettes. And perhaps maybe more importantly, we found that as alcohol use increased, the heavier the alcohol use was in the past month, the more likely that young person was to also report using marijuana, other illicit drugs, and cigarette use. So there is a relationship between the heaviness, or I should say, the frequency of use.
Tell us about nicotine or cigarette use.
Yeah, the same pattern held true. Young people who didn't use cigarettes were far less likely to use other substances compared to their peers. So those who used cigarettes in the past month were 4 times more likely to use alcohol. They were 10 times more likely to report heavy alcohol use. 7.7 times more likely to report other illicit drugs. It isn't just one substance for teenagers. The use is and non-use is closely connected.
So remember how I mentioned about why we called it one choice. And it really comes down to that thing that Corinne just talked about with that incredible data that we found, is that substance use is completely related in teens. And so it's if a teen has said yes to one substance, their risk of saying yes to other substances is much higher. And when I talk to parents, a lot of times parents, they don't really quite get this. I feel like they have something that they are telling themselves, like, I'm not so worried as long as they're just smoking pot here at home, or I'm not so worried, if just a little beer, it's not a big deal. But they don't realize that once it's like a light switch, once it's on, there are all of a sudden all these other questions that youth now has: when to use, which substances to use, how much to use, under what circumstances to use, what delivery device to use. So for example, that vaping as an entree into smoking was almost gone in this country in teens when that vaping was introduced. And now what you're seeing is that vaping is unfortunately a huge entry into smoking traditional cigarettes for youth. And we can see that smoking cigarettes is then a risk factor for other substances like marijuana products or alcohol and other substances. So that's why we have this one choice. If you've made the choice not to use, if you've made that internal choice, then you're in a much better position from a health standpoint.
I love the visual of a light switch turning on to kind of encapsulate and even all the litany of things that you just ran through that goes off in a teen's head who has stepped into substances. I've not thought of it that way, that this whole world of use opens up the minute you step into it. And
exactly. And I think that is really what happens. And when you talk to teens about their use, you can often see that progression. So as Corinne says, any individual, you could have a teen that you could speak to that's like, no, I only use marijuana, I don't use anything else.
Right.
But it's actually hard as time goes on. You get fewer and fewer of those. And when you talk to teens who are using substances, they'll talk about this progression of, well, first I was using this and then I was using that. And it's like a huge range of options that then open up to them and decisions that they have to make.
Right.
But if they make that decision to be a non-user, if they make that choice, then it's really simple. And the answer is no to all of those things. And when I talk about this, a lot of times people are like, yeah, but that's not realistic. Like, that's ridiculous because experimentation is a normal part of adolescence, or it's what everybody's doing, are kind of the narratives that I often hear with that.
Yeah. What do you find in the numbers? Is that true?
So this is the best because this is what I can show to the parents and get one reaction, and I can show to the kids and get a different reaction. So this is, again, big data that, like Corinne was talking about, this is data from what's called Monitoring the Future, which is how the country really looks at substance use in teens over time. And we have this data all the way back from the mid-70s up through the current time. So we can really see how has that stayed the same or how has that changed. We usually look at this data to think how many kids are using marijuana, like 12th graders today compared to 12th graders 10 years ago or something like that. We look at specific substances. But we asked of the data a different question, and that is how many kids were not using any substances? And we went right to the kind of toughest group. We went to the high school seniors to look at this.
So you're effectively asking, have kids been making that one choice not to use?
Right, exactly. Is that realistic, or is this like pie in the sky? Like, yeah, sure, you can find a unicorn every once in a while, but it's so rare that it's not even worth thinking about. And what we found is that back in the 80s, it actually was pretty rare. So a lot of the parents we talked to, or educators, or physicians we talked to, they actually went to high school in the 80s. And so they have a perception that everybody uses because, unfortunately, that is kind of what their life experience played out.
Wow.
But it's not the case anymore. So now we have this amazing data that shows, so if you break this down into two different groups, so one group is a lifetime non-use. So these are high school seniors who have never in their lifetime used any substances. And that's where I get back to that list. They haven't used alcohol. They haven't used nicotine. They haven't used any marijuana products. They haven't used any other substances. Nothing. Back in the 80s, that number was like 5%.
Wow.
That had never used.
Yes.
Now it's 31%. Over 30% of high school seniors have never in their lifetime used any substances. That's almost a third of a senior high school class. And this is nationwide data. This isn't like some cherry-picked high school somewhere. This is like everywhere. Wow. And this is happening. Wow. And even more exciting than that is super exciting.
Right.
But even more exciting is the past month data, because it's really important to understand that a health choice isn't like a purity test. You either are making a healthy choice or you're not, and you're doomed. And you can understand how silly that is. If I said you didn't wear your seatbelt yesterday, so there's no point in you wearing it today. Right. That would make no sense at all. That's ridiculous. Right. So you can always choose to start making healthy choices, exercise more and eat healthy diets and wear your seatbelt. So we looked at this data again with these high school seniors thinking about the past month use.
Okay.
And again, dramatic difference. So back in the 80s, the number of high school seniors who hadn't used any substances was somewhere around 16%.
Wow.
And
in the past, they hadn't used any substances in the past 30 days.
In the past month.
Okay.
When they were asked this survey, in the past month, have you used any of these things?
Got it.
A very small number of them said, no, I haven't used any.
Got it.
Now, if you ask high school seniors, or this most recent data that I've got here is from 2019, it was almost 60%. It was 59% of high school seniors said they hadn't used anything in the past month. That is so exciting.
It's mind-blowing and it's so exciting. And tell me, why does this not feel like our experience? Because I think every parent that I would talk to about this, or if I said this to, they would say, no, that can't be right. So
right.
why?
And they're absolutely going to say that. And in fact, when you start talking to the kids, they often will start out with that position too.
Yeah.
And this is something that my kids joke about, and that is that the people who are using are louder. They're like posting on Instagram kind of parties that they're at and social events where even if it's not actually showing substance use, you can infer substance use from it. And then you hear their conversations on Monday morning about what they did the weekend. Yeah. You're getting a lot of that. And of course, the bad outcomes are from kids that are doing things, people who've gotten in trouble with their parents or with the law.
And those bad outcomes, you think, get amplified?
Absolutely. And you're like, kids these days, blah, 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 kind of like going back into that old kind of way of thinking. Yeah. But in fact, there's a whole group of kids that are not using, but they do what I call fly under the radar. They don't say, yay, another drug-free weekend. That's not something that they broadcast.
Right.
But if you look at what they're up to, you can see they're athletes, they're academically minded, they're socially minded. This is a generation that's very involved in causes and community, and they're doing other things. So you can read between the lines and realize this is happening if you look for it.
Oh my gosh. It's kind of information that I feel like I just need to sit with for a while and really internalize and think about what to do with it. I mean, as parents, I don't know if we want to dive into the parenting strategy, but how can we support kids, or how could we even, prior to supporting, deal with this bias where every one of us is coming to the conversation thinking everyone is using, whether you're a teen or a parent? How do we push back on that? Any thoughts?
Well, I would say, and particularly as a parent of a child on the younger side, I'm thinking about my first grader here. I think the first thing is to start early with age appropriate conversations and realizing that drug prevention is not a single conversation. Like so many things that we face as parents, difficult conversations don't just happen once and then they're done. They change over time and they grow as your child grows. So I would say first, starting early and putting it into age appropriate sort of segments. And with my very young child, I talk about vitamins, and you take your vitamin, only what your doctor says is okay, what's prescribed, which for him it's 2 now, but a year ago it was only 1. And why is that? Because his body is bigger, he's growing, and we don't share with our younger brother, we don't share with mom and dad. It's very interesting. Those lines are very clear. And he's young, but we're starting now because down the road it's going to be what he's prescribed. And, we're going to talk about alcohol. We're going to talk about everything else in an appropriate way.
Right. There's some talk about, resiliency and stuff when they're young. I hadn't actually thought about behavioral kinds of conversations. This is how we engage with medicines or vitamins. And these are the ways in which I don't know, just those behavioral kinds of directions are fantastic. Tell us about older kids. I do think everyone's doing it and it's just a little bit of alcohol. The conversations get hard and heated when your kids get older. And I don't know really many parents who get in and out of this conversation without emotion and feelings hurt and just a lot of tumult in the family because kids don't want to hear it or parents aren't sure. So I don't know. Any thoughts about that?
I think you're onto something there, Debbie. And I also think parents have a tough time when they look at their own history about past substance use and they say, I did X, Y, and Z and I'm fine. So who am I to say, don't do this? But I'm thinking, I'm definitely making my kids wear helmets no matter what. As we get more information and as our understanding of brain development and the need for brain protection grows, our what we do in response to that information also has to change.
Right. That was really well constructed. And I'm just speaking from my own experience. I was a teenager in the 80s. I was definitely in the group that was using. I think the science is this great gift because as a parent, it allows me to go, you know what? My experience was not the experience that I want to promote because we know more now. If we had known the science back then, hopefully my parents would have stepped in and been a little more proactive and a little bit more invasive, if you will, into my life and into my decision making. But I do think that's a process. I think all parents kind of have to step up to this and let it transform inside of them because there is such an instinct to say, it's just part of high school. I'm okay. It didn't matter.
Or even that it's positive. I mean, I think you get some parents that really feel like that's what's fun about high school or college. I can get into that too. And they worry if they have too hard a line with their kids, either the kids are going to lie, which we can talk about that a little bit, how you keep open communication. But also they worry that their kids are going to lose out on what's fun about being a high school student. And it's a complicated topic. And I think it's important for parents to really think about what was their substance use, they themselves thinking about was their substance use like when they were in high school, what happened to them, what happened to other people. So for example, we know that there are a lot of bad things happened to people. So we have a little maybe pink cloud on, we remember our high school time as being this very positive time. But for example, sexual assault is very common when you're talking about high school students and substance use. Violence was bad. Again, and then academic failure was high. And tragedies. I had a classmate of mine in high school who died in a car accident my senior year. And I think we all carry her with us to a way. I mean, I could still tear up thinking about it. She lost her life as a senior in high school. We were just getting started. And I bet most of us have horrible, tragic stories like that. So to get away a little bit from the romanticization of it and say, wait a second, was that a good idea? Did that really work out well for everybody? I mean, maybe I'm okay, but is everybody okay?
That is really great advice. And not only do you romanticize it, but my memory just isn't that great anymore. So I can't even remember. Really kind of stepping up and looking critically at what the past was like is such good advice.
And another thing I think important to keep in here, and this is our talk about like a touchy topic, but I do think parents need to think about what their own substance use is like now.
Right.
So some parents, of course, are going to have had a substance use disorder and maybe they're in recovery, for example, and they're going to have clarity of message, perhaps, in terms of that journey that can be really powerful for their kids. I find that some parents in recovery are kind of hesitant to explain that to their kids. So the kids know it, but they don't really know the whole story. And I think it might be valuable to think about that. Other parents may still be struggling with substance use of their own. And then there are other people who have substance use as just part of their daily experience. And they don't think about what are they modeling for those kids. And so I really think it is important to think, are you modeling substances as being a way to cope or a way to relax or a way to have fun? And how do you think your young child or your teenager is going to interpret that?
Right.
And what is that going to mean in terms of the decisions that they make?
Right. It is a touchy subject because adults don't want to be told what to do, even if it's in the best interest of people around them. I always want to encourage parents to really embrace that there's two standards of behavior, one for over 21 and one for under 21. If we could just be more careful about that bridge. I think parents where alcohol, for example, is a big part of, like you described, just their life. It's just a way in which they engage, really making that distinction and not accidentally or unintentionally or casually bringing your children into that part of your life, which I think is unintuitive. I think if it is a big part of your life, you do want to introduce it to your kids, and you do want them to come with you at some point in time. And, as they hit 18, and, it feels like parents will start to just become more permissive just naturally. And if we could even just, like I said, have a little bit more of a hard stop and really, kind of honor that firewall at 21 and really understand why we are honoring that firewall.
And I think the brain science really gives you that. The substances are going to affect that developing brain differently. It's actually not an arbitrary number, that 21. And one of the ways that I see this is with car rentals. They won't rent cars to people under 25. Well, that's not because they're looking at the brain science. They're looking at the accident data, and they've made a judgment that does have to do with the brain science, even though they don't necessarily realize that. And but there's a positive side of this. The kids I talk to, the teens I talk to, the college students I talk to, they love to know that their brain is still growing and developing, and that they have room for their brain to be smarter, faster, better. And so it's not a bad thing that their brain's still developing. It's a great thing, but we definitely want to protect it. We want to think about that brain protection.
This is such great information. The other thing that I've learned as I've been parenting is that how to connect and how to belong in the world is a neurological and a very distinct phase of human development. And that a lot of the foundation of that gets laid down in that adolescent time with that limbic system. And I find that exciting and another motivator for not introducing drugs and alcohol. Because it seems, and tell me if you agree or if you see this in the science, if kids can show up to college having not used anything, they're better equipped. They understand how to connect. They understand how to make friends. They've traversed a couple of awkward situations and lived through it. And so it seems like they're better equipped to go into college and in any life after high school. It doesn't have to just be college, and just be more ready to take on what that new phase of life is going to bring them. Does that sound right?
I absolutely think so. The conversation about college, I think, is a really important one, because even parents who had pretty strict rules through high school sometimes let go of that when the kids go to college, with, again, a new wave of that kind of nostalgia of what college experience is like. Or even if they didn't go to college themselves, again, what the kind of movie version of college is.
Right.
But if you think about that cohort, that almost a third of high school seniors who've never used any substances, they're arriving on the college campus or to their first job or to whatever that's happening with their next stage of life. They're arriving never having used, and they are really set up to continue to make smart choices for their health and to take advantage of the kind of other alternative things other than, quote, partying, that are kind of ubiquitous in those early adult environments. But also, I never want to kind of have, again, that line in the sand. Those people who haven't used in the past month, that almost 60% of high school seniors who haven't used in the past month, they also, as you say, they've already traversed a lot of situations where they haven't used, where they've made the choice to, for example, invest in their studies or invest in their athletics or invest in something that they care about. They're also aware of mental health in a way that I think previous generations were not as savvy about. And there is a very significant connection between substance use and worsening mental health problems. And this generation actually sees that a lot more. And so they are, again, protecting their health in a way that's really powerful. And so all these conversations you can have don't have to be like, because I told you so, because I'm the expert adult. Right. It's like, no, you guys, in fact, are the expert. Let's go with what your generation knows.
how can we support kids that are making this decision not to use? And I agree that past 30-day number getting bigger and bigger is so exciting because I love the seatbelt example. Well, you didn't wear your seatbelt yesterday, but that doesn't mean you're never going to wear it again. You can always be in that past 30-day group based on your own decision making. So there's a lot of potential there. So we are thinking a little bit about back to school and how can we as parents support these kids and these decisions or these inklings or tendencies to not use or to try stopping. Any thoughts and anything relative to going back to school? Because it's kind of all here.
We recently met with a group of high school students who are helping us put together a resource list, which we'll also share with you, Debbie. And we asked them, what do you want to hear from your parents? What kind of resources are you interested in and what would be helpful? And one of the things when they were reflecting about their relationships with their parents is they said, it would be, this is what we expect. And of course, and this is their words saying, if I don't make the choice you want me to make, I also need to know that you're going to be there for me, right? To be reliable. But having that expectation of non-use and this is something our family has decided, this is the expectation for you, really does make a difference in the decisions that those teens are making. And that security, awesome. Knowing that parents or whoever that caregiver is, they can rely on them. That's a really important part.
Another thing that came out of that, even kids that are trying really hard to make smart choices can end up in complicated situations.
Right.
And recognizing that it can happen very fast and very unexpectedly. So I often find when I talk to younger kids, older elementary school kids or beginning middle school students, they're like, oh no, cigarettes are bad or alcohol is bad. I would never do drugs. They have conviction. They know, they feel strong. And they also assume that their friends all feel the same. They're like, yes, all my friends are like this. Everybody, of course, they're not idiots. They kind of get that point across to them. But when you get into high school, it gets complicated, and it can get complicated really fast. So friends that you thought were similar to you all of a sudden are doing different things. They're making different choices. And it can be tricky. And so maybe you do end up using in a situation because everybody's using and you have that peer pressure and you're like, oh my gosh, I just crossed that line and I did do it and now I'm confused and I'm scared and I'm whatever. You're in a situation and you're like, I'm not using, but I don't understand how to get myself out of this and keep my social standing or whatever, or not look like an idiot or whatever. And so a lot of the kids are looking for their parents to have their backs. They're looking for their parents to know that they are not going to just be angry and punitive, but are going to be able to help them navigate this complexity. And there are a couple different clues that they said that they thought would be helpful for this. One of them is the idea, if you're in a situation you need help for, is to have a family code that you could text to your family that says, like, this is bad. I told you I was going to my friend's house and, for a sleepover, but it's not what I thought. But you can't text that necessarily because your phone might be seen by other people and that sort of thing. So if you have a little code, that family word, that could be seen by someone else but not understood. And then the parent would get that code and be like, oh, that means I have to either pick them up or do something to intervene. And so, some parents will then call and be like, oh, I'm really sorry. I know you said you could spend the night, but something's come up in the family and I need to come get you. I'm going to be there in 5 minutes. And they give an out for that student. And they know it's not that there's no consequences, but that the parent's going to engage with them. It's like a contract in a way. Like, I'm going to engage with you on this and like, whoa, what happened? And how do we help you in the future?
Right. This idea that we make mistakes, I feel like gets lost really quickly for parents when it comes to substance use. And being able to hold both of those ideas, we have the standard, you just made a mistake and broke the standard. And be able to kind of reconcile that or move forward with the discomfort of that as a parent, right? we want everything to be black and white, and it's just not. And do you find that parents who, once they help a child extract themselves from a difficult situation, can have conversations about what went wrong and what do we need to do next time? Does that need to be the nature of those conversations in your mind?
I think so. One of the things as a psychiatrist, so kind of putting on one of my other hats, one
Yes.
of the things that I think is really important is maybe don't have that conversation right away. So I always talk about don't have serious conversations at night when people are tired. And now we have the potential that they're tired, they're stressed, and potentially they've been using a substance that they weren't supposed to use. None of that is a good time to talk about. So this has to do with safety. This has to do with kind of conveying that parental information that, like, I've got you whether you're doing the right thing or you've got doing the wrong thing. My love is unconditional to you, but we are going to talk about this in the morning. And that gives the parent a little space, because the parent may be just very distressed. Not a great time, because you're going to probably let a lot of that emotion come through and have not the most productive conversation. So the next day is the time to be like, whoa, let's all talk about what happened and where do we go from here?
Right.
I think it's also worth mentioning that we're looking at this issue, specifically substance use, through the lens of health, right? And sort of underscoring that just because someone uses a substance, that's not a moral judgment, but that's a choice that has health consequences. And that's something that we should think about and we should talk about. When talking with teens, the teens that we relate to, they really appreciate the fact that this all has to do with physical health, mental health, that connection, and their overall wellness. And they get the concept of self-care. And when we put this into that framework of we're talking about your self-care and protecting your brain development and your future, I think it really resonates in a really positive way.
That's very hopeful and very encouraging. I just want to ask real quick, you talked to, maybe we did, this concept that if you're a parent in recovery, and so you have addiction that runs in your family, and I think you already said talking with kids about that can be very useful and difficult, because recovery is difficult. But I can imagine a parent who really is, maybe they've shared it all with their kid, maybe they haven't, but their kid starts to use, and really becoming scared about, that one use could kick off this, horrific path for their child. Any advice for that parent? Anything about the science?
I think this is a really great question. So one thing is to think about risk. So who's at risk for a substance use disorder? So sometimes I'll hear from parents and they're like, oh, I'm not worried about my kid because substance use disorders don't run in my family. Well, I hate to tell them this, but they are at risk. They're still at risk. Everybody who has a brain is at risk. So that's the only criteria for the risk for having a substance use disorder is you have a brain and you expose it to this. If you never expose it to any of these substances, you will definitely not develop a substance use disorder. But the other thing is that having a family history is not like a sure thing. It's not like, even if both parents have a substance use disorder, it's not a guarantee that that offspring is going to have a substance use disorder. So you don't have to catastrophize and say like, oh my gosh, one exposure and the game's over. No, that's not the case. It's a process to develop a substance use disorder, not a one-time thing. So I think that can be kind of reassuring, again, kind of back you down from that kind of like, oh my gosh, this is really bad. But I think that fear that parent that you were imagining is really valuable, and figuring out how to communicate that to your child and to say, look, this is why I'm so worried. And you do have a heightened risk because you have a family history. So that puts you at a higher risk, and you're young and your developing brain puts you at a higher risk. And so here's why I think it's really important that you don't use these substances. And again, be inclusive on the substances. I've mentioned it a little bit, but if you just say don't use drugs, that can be misinterpreted. Like, do you mean alcohol? Do you mean nicotine? Do you mean if you're just vaping? And what if you're vaping something that doesn't have THC or doesn't have nicotine? Or what if you're vaping something that does? See all those 10,000 questions again. And that's why it's really important to have this conversation and be really clear about what it is that you're asking them to avoid and why. In the end, each of us is individuals, and we are going to go out in the world and make our own individual choices. And so what you're trying to do is help your child have the best possible start to that and be able to continue to make smart choices for themselves and for their health.
Right. That was a really great response to that. I really appreciate that. I know a lot of our listeners will as well. In this back to school time, it is a hopeful time, and it's what you want. You see all the potential and the excitement of the new year, and wanting great outcomes for your kids is really what we're talking about here. So would you say that adding the substance use conversation to that start is really a great way to support and empower your kids for this, fantastic upcoming 9 months?
Yeah, I think absolutely. This is a great time to have this conversation. And also because of what I said about how each year the situation changes a little bit. So it may be that your kid felt confident at the end of the last year about how they fit in socially and with their decision making about this. But when they come back from summer vacation, it's kind of a changed deal. Right. And so again, having that conviction, one of the things that I think can be really helpful is to affiliate with the idea of being a one choice person or a one choice kid, and to literally articulate that to oneself. It's not a purity pledge. I don't want parents to use that in some kind of, moralistic, again, way of saying things. But if you've made this decision for yourself, it's helpful to kind of feel like you're part of a larger group, to picture that 30% of high school seniors that you are joining. And at earlier ages, it's a much higher percentage of people who are non-users of anything and who have never used anything, or joining that 60% of people who haven't used in the past month, and kind of having that no, I've made my decision. So heading into the school year with that intention, I think is really empowering. The other thing is to think about why. What is the reason you're making that choice? So what do you want from this school year? I love that concept of the start of the school year. It's such a powerful, it's so positive. There's so many exciting things about it. I was in school forever, so I feel really great about the first day of school. I always think it's silly that January 1st is the new year, because everybody knows that it's this new school year. So it's like September 1st-ish is the new year. That's when it starts fresh and you're all excited. But let's think about the why. Why have you decided not to use any substances? And so one of the things that one of our partner organizations have developed an actual mosaic wall where the students can write on these colorful tiles why they are making this choice to be drug-free. So they have the opportunity to anonymously just write, I'm doing it because I want to be an athlete, or I want to be on the debate team, or I have a family history that I want to protect myself from, or I have a history of depression and I want to protect my mental health, or whatever it is their personal. It's very personal and individual. But thinking about why they're going into this school year and what they're excited about for this school year could be a really helpful conversation and a really positive one.
I like that. And you could do it at all levels, individual, family, friends, larger community of any kind. And what a great way to start talking about this too, in outcome-based and a positive spin on why we would choose not to use. So, well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I deeply appreciate both of you being here. Any final last words before we sign off?
Thank you for the opportunity. Anytime we have a chance to share the data about both the connectivity of substance use for teens to educate parents, but also that growing percentage of young people who aren't using anything, and try and amplify the voices of those young people, we want to do it. And thank you. It's terrific. And we're so glad to be able to share the One Choice data.
Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
We want to remind listeners that all Talk They Hear You materials, including this podcast, can be found on the Talk They Hear You website, which is those words spelled out, Talk They Hear You, at samhsa.gov, SAMHSA.gov. Please share the site and this podcast with your friends. The more we can be in conversation with each other, the better for everyone, especially our kids. And we would like to hear from you. Would you like to be on our show? Do you have stories to share or tips or techniques that have worked or not worked for you as a parent? Do you have questions for us or any feedback on topics or improvements of any kind? We know that your input will help us design the most useful interviews possible. For any of this, please contact us at whatparentsaresaying@gmail.com. Again, all the words spelled out, whatparentsaresaying@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.